today's talk, this is really a partial summary of one of the books that Ben just mentioned, the Penguin book that came out last year, a couple of years ago. And it's an attempt to kind of conceptualize a lot of history and a lot of space. And the word Persianate, although it was invented way back in 1973 or 4, I believe, by Marshall Hodgson, the very famous historian of Islam, it never really took off until the current century. And I think there are reasons why that happened, but it really was only in the last 15, 20 years that it's taken flight. And I think it's an important way of looking at a history through the lens of a language and a literary tradition, rather than through a religious lens. And that really is kind of the larger point I want to make here. But when we think of Persian today, we normally think of it as the national language of Iran, which of course is true. But actually, Iran is only a small remnant of a once huge swath of Eurasia in which the Persian language and its literary canon was a cosmopolitan and very prestigious tradition for nearly 1,000 years. It's really on a par in that sense with Greek or Latin or Sanskrit. And I'm going to define it in a very rough sense, as you see here, as an integrated sense of moral, socio-political, and aesthetic order informed by the circulation of Persian texts considered prestigious and normative. On a geographical sense, these texts circulated through a vast span stretching from the Balkans to Bengal, with extensions clear out to Southeast Asia between the 9th and 19th century. So spatially, roughly, this is the area that we're looking at. But the historian's questions, of course, are why do things begin when they did, and why do they end when they do? So I want to raise the question about origins. And to do that, we need to go back to the year 651. Well, there are many ways of saying the origins, but I'm going to start in 651, which is the year that this brilliant empire of the Iranian plateau, Sasanian Empire, was defeated by Arabs with enormous consequences, political, but also social and linguistic. These Arab armies overthrew the dynasty, swiftly annexing the former territories of the Sasanians. The last Sasanian Shahnameh, you see one of them depicted here shooting the lion, fled all the way to China, the Tang Dynasty China. And so it was a total disaster, politically speaking. And at this time, here's the territorial extent of the empire as of 651. And the empire was replaced, of course, by a number of Arab empires, the Abbasid being the most important and long-lasting, ruling from the mid-8th century from the new city of Baghdad. And at this time, of course, the Arab caliphs or rulers installed Arabic language for administration, commerce, literature, education, and so forth, effectively submerging Middle Persian for a long period of time, until that language eventually emerged or re-emerged in a sense as New Persian or Modern Persian. And this took place not long after the Abbasid Empire was in power. Now, interestingly enough, by establishing the new Abbasid capital in Baghdad, it's only 16 miles northwest of Ctesiphon, which was the capital of the Sasanians. And that's important because the palace is still standing, not far from Baghdad, you see here, because in a sense, the Abbasid caliphs appropriated and took over many of the ruling ideals of the old Sasanian Persian Empire. And we see this taking place concurrently with a linguistic revolution in which this new Persian, which is still spoken today, as a kind of a synthesis of Middle Persian of the Sasanians and Arabic. And so this took place particularly not in the modern Iran, it's important to say, but in Central Asia, where some of you folks will be going, and more specifically in Bukhara, the capital of what would become the Samanid Emirate or Samanid Empire. Now, the Samanids were officially only a province of the Abbasid Caliph, but in effect they were independent. And it is here where modern Persian was incubated and patronized, and for the first time used as an official court language and administrative language. This happened in the 8th and 9th centuries. Now, this linguistic evolution that I'm speaking of here has fascinating parallels with English, because here you have the conquest of Iran in 642. It wasn't until another 300 years that the earliest literary use of this modern Persian appears. Rudaki is often seen as the first great poet in Persian in the late 10th century. Then after another 2.5 centuries, it's when we come to the appearance of classical literature, a whole cluster of classical poets and literati, of whom Nizami is only one. Now that pattern of moving from conquest to initial literature to classical literature with 300 years and 250 is almost exactly paralleled with English, where you have the Battle of Hastings in 1066, where French is imposed over Anglo-Saxon. After 300 years, you get Chaucer, the earliest kind of modern English literature, and then another 2.5 centuries, you come to Shakespeare. So there's a fascinating connection between modern Persian and modern English in terms of their literary and linguistic cultures. And I use that parallel as a way of thinking about how modern Persian emerged. But importantly, it began as a lingua franca and only became a classical language itself with great deal of prestige after some time. Bukhara, again, was the kind of place where this modern Persian language was incubated and patronized by the emirs, who were, as I said, officially subservient to the Arab Caliph in Baghdad. But the Arab Caliph, the Abbasid Caliph, was little more than the mayor of Baghdad, while the emirs, or as they would later be known as sultans of the Samanid dynasty, were effectively independent. Here's the famous tomb that survives even today in Bukhara. So the question then, why did Persian survive? And then why did it flourish? I ask that because many languages of the Middle East in the wake of the Arab conquest, if not disappeared, at least shrank severely. This is true of Coptic, it was true of Aramaic, it was true of Syriac, all of which were used either liturgically or ritually, and therefore were in some sense a rival to Arabic, the language of Islam. Persian, by contrast, did not have any direct association with religion. It was not used ritually or liturgically in the same way that Arabic was in Islam. The very word for Persian was not identified with any ethnic group, unlike Arabic or Turkish or French or so many other languages. The word Farsi simply refers to a region, a geographical region, Pars in southern Iran. The other word for Persian is Dari, which simply means the court. So not being identified with any religious or ethnic group, the Persian language was in a sense detached, it was mobile. Moreover, it grew up in an area, as I said, in Bukhara, Central Asia, which was very cosmopolitan. It was on the Silk Road connecting China with the Mediterranean basin. We see here Zoroastrians, Christians, Manichaeans, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, all of them in the area. Multilingual, Turkish, Arabic, Sogdian, as well as this new Persian.
It's hard to tell just where that is.
Yeah.
So New Persian emerged in a sense as a lingua franca, a common denominator. And it's interesting that Persian also filled some gaps that were left by Arabic. Arabic, after all, had no tradition of imperialism. It never had ruled over large agrarian societies like the Byzantine or the Sasanian empires had done. It had no tradition of statecraft or political thought. It had no genre of epic literature, which would enable people to imagine trans-regional political space. And most importantly, it had no tradition of a service class of professional writers who would manage large bureaucracies, keep the records, and maintain the administrative machinery. By contrast, for over 1,000 years before the Arab conquest occurred, there was a tradition of successive imperial dynasties on the Iranian plateau that relied upon the expertise of a professional writing class. So that each new dynasty, from the Achaemenids through the Parthians and the Samanids and many others, would simply recruit writers from their predecessors. And that's fascinating because you have that tradition of writing, administrative technology already established, which of course the Abbasids and other dynasties in the region took over. Also, importantly, at the period of the Samanid rulers in the 9th and 10th centuries in Bukhara, the technology of paper making arrived across the Silk Road from China. And this totally revolutionized the technology of knowledge. It meant not only that administration was much more easy, obviously paper is easy to work with than tablets or reeds of various kinds. And it also accelerated the movement of written literature. Books could appear. And the diffusion, therefore, of Persian literature was facilitated by this technology of paper making. It's very interesting that the word for paper in Persian, kagaz, is used throughout India by most all vernacular languages, some form or another of paper and pen. Kagaz, kalam are used throughout the Indian subcontinent, which tells you a great deal about the advent of this revolutionary technology of knowledge. This is important because it facilitated the diffusion of a Persian canon. And I like to think about this canon as something that was accelerated not only by paper, but by the appearance of many courts across the Eastern Islamic world, which sought these literati, famous poets, as a way of bumping up their own prestige. And also, the poets themselves needed patronage. So there's a kind of a symbiotic relationship between poets and literati on the one hand, and up-and-coming rulers, sultans on the make, if you will. There was a great deal of competition. Which court could have the best and the brightest of poets? And a useful way of thinking about this is network theory, where you see on this abstract diagram dots which symbolize centers of production or patronage, and then lines which indicate the roots, circulation of people and of texts. It's a way of thinking about how this Persianate world worked, spanning across political boundaries. Simply works through the circulation of texts, which really is what I think defines the idea of this Persianate world. Another way that of thinking about it is through the diffusion of new states. The Ghaznavid Empire was one of the successor states to the Samanids, and they diffused from their capital in Ghazni, some just south of Kabul in eastern Afghanistan, stretching all the way west into the Iranian plateau and all the way east into the Punjab in India. And this particular dynasty, the Ghaznavids, patronized one of the most important poets in all Persian, without any doubt. This is, of course, Ferdowsi, who was patronized by the Ghaznavid Mahmud of Ghazni. And he wrote this book of Kings, the Shahnameh, was one of several poets patronized by the Ghaznavids. Farrukh Sistani, Unsuri, Manucheri were others. But Ferdowsi needs to be singled out here because the Shahnameh, in a sense, established a new genre of epic Persian poetry. The Book of Kings, of course, refers to the historical as well as mythological kings of pre-Islamic Iran. But interestingly enough, it's not just Iran. It also celebrates heroes like Alexander, who paradoxically conquered Iran, but then becomes, according in Ferdowsi, assimilated into this larger world. Now here we see the map of Alexander's own conquests, and he emerges in the Shahnameh as a universal king. Why? Because he conquered everything from Europe all the way to India. He also is seen as a Persian king, because in Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, he was born the secret son of a Persian princess and the Persian emperor himself, Darius the Great. So he's assimilated, in other words, into the lineage of Persian kings. And also, even before Ferdowsi's time, Muslims had identified Alexander with the enigmatic figure in the Quran, known as He of Two Horns, Dhul Qarnayn, who traversed the world from east to west, thwarting the forces of evil. So in a sense, therefore, in the hands of Ferdowsi, Alexander becomes not only a universal king and not only a Persian king, but also a quasi-messianic figure. And it wasn't just Ferdowsi, but other poets picked up the same idea and celebrated the notion of Alexander. And I mention this because, in a sense, Alexander made it, the Alexander epic and the various Sekundernamas that would appear later on in Persian history enabled peoples across the Persian-speaking world and even beyond to imagine Alexander as inhabiting this larger political space, but also a Persianate space. And of course, this space was something that was imagined analogous to the way that Romans could imagine themselves in Plato's Academy in Athens, in the western side of the Greek world, in the eastern side of that same world, in the Indian sphere. We have Indo-Greek rulers who issued coins with Greek on one side and early Indian scripts on the other side. The point here being that the Greeks had also, before the Persian cosmopolis came into being, had created their own kind of trans-regional world which skipped over political boundaries. And that's really the point here. So a canon of Persian literature emerges in the 14th and 15th century, composed largely of poets, on the left-hand side you see here, but also of historians like Behaqi, Juzjani, Rashid ad-Din, or political theorists like Nizam al-Mulk, Tusi, and others. And this canon, in a sense, articulated a sense of moral order and social order, which was inculcated by these texts which circulated so widely. And they include not just epic poetry, but also ideals of Sufism, of morality, romance literature, especially history, politics, and so forth. And what's interesting is that geographically, we can see the distribution. For example, here in the early 13th century, Nizami, the great poet of stories, romance literature, was not from Iran, but from the Caucasus and Ganja, far to the west in the early 13th century. In the 11th century, Hujwiri, the first great author of treatises on Sufism, emerges in Lahore. in the Punjab. Amir Khosrow, one of the greatest poets of Persian literature and poetry, emerges in Delhi. He spent his whole life in Delhi. And far to the west, in Konya, it was where the great mystical poet Jalaluddin Rumi settles. The point here being that all these literati emerge and live their most productive years of their lives very far from Bukhara, which was the initial kind of point of incubation of New Persia. So I want to then speak very briefly, therefore, to how it was that the growth of this world took place. Part of it simply was through the expansion of states that patronized Persian language and Persian poetry. We see this initially, as I said earlier, with the Ghaznavid Empire, where Mahmud of Ghazni created for the first time a poet laureate, thereby fusing together Persian literati with Persian politics. That is to say that there's an official poet laureate that's patronized by the court. And this tradition then gets passed on as the empire moves, first from Ghazni, then into Lahore. That idea is maintained, that continues. When the Seljuk Turks arrive, sweeping away the Ghaznavids, but they themselves patronize Persian, moving across the entire Iranian plateau into Azerbaijan, into the Caucasus, Anatolia, as you see here, down into the Fertile Crescent. Although they're Turks, the Seljuks adopted Persian titles like Khosrow or Kaikous. They issued coins with the lion and sun image, the ancient symbol of Iranian kingship. They traced their origins to Persian kings, even though they were not Persian. They obviously came from a Turkish background of Central Asia. And most importantly, they used Persian as the language of administration. So it's interesting that just as the Arabs turned to the skills of Sasanian writers for managing their vast empire, the Abbasid Empire, so too the Seljuk Turks recruited Persian administrators to do for the same purpose. Literati like Nizam al-Mulk wrote essays, specifically the Shahnameh, basically to educate these Turks how to do it. If you're going to run an empire, this is what you do. And in a sense, it was the whole baton was passed on to the Seljuk Turks in that way. In addition to the migration or the expansion of states that patronize Persian, you also have the dynamic of migration. And here, of course, the big story is Genghis Khan in the year 1219, moving all the way from Angolia straight to Central Asia. And he is succeeded, of course, by other Mongol conquerors who, as you see in the map, subjugate China, Tibet, the entire Iranian plateau, the Middle East, all the way up to Anatolia, and indeed through Azerbaijan into Russia. And what this does is it derives thousands of traumatized Persian speakers who are refugees. It drives them into other lands where they could seek shelter. And this is a very important dynamic because, for example, the Delhi Sultanate, established by Turks in the early 13th century, in 1206, was there just in time to receive thousands and thousands of traumatized Turks and literati, Persian literati, fleeing Central Asia, fleeing the Mongols, and resettling in places like Lahore and Delhi. And so that's a very important dynamic that happens here, because it now means that areas of the world that had been on the far frontier, the fringe of the Persian world, they now become themselves capitals. They now themselves become centers of Persian production. While the kind of heartland, the Iranian plateau proper, is hollowed out by the Mongols, and these other regions are become centers for the reception and for the patronage of refugees from the Mongols. And the Mongols don't end in 219. That's just when Genghis Khan first came into Central Asia. That continues for another 150 years, constant Mongol invasions, driving ever more. So it's a process that continues for several hundred years of people fleeing into seeking refuge in places like Anatolia and of course, India. So migration becomes a second factor here, which explains the growth of this Persian world. And a third one is probably the most important, but also the most subtle, and it's the whole business of emulation. I mean, you think about how, blue jeans and Coca-Cola have now diffused throughout the whole world, not by American conquest, obviously, but by people who simply wanted to identify themselves with what was considered fashionable. And this really explains, I think, a great deal of the diffusion of this Persianate world, more so than the expansion of states or even of migration. For example, take the idea of justice as a principle. Now, justice, the idea of justice hardly begins with Islam. I mean, it's found in the Quran. It's found even before the rise of Islam in Mesopotamian literature, but it becomes central to the understanding of Sasanian kingship, Sasanian Persian kingship, and it does get passed on into all these subsequent dynasties, such as the Samanids in Bukhara, such as the Ghaznavids, the Seljuks, and all the rest of them. And this idea of justice is so important that I would argue that even in the Persianate world, at least, it becomes more important than religion itself. Here we have this famous formula of Ibn Balkhi, an important historian in the early 12th century, who writes, "There is no kingdom without an army, no army without wealth, no wealth without material prosperity, and no material prosperity without justice." So that justice becomes kind of the kingpin of a whole ideology which incorporates morality, economy, politics, and kingship, all of it into a single coherent worldview. And you notice what's missing here. There's no mention of God. There's no mention of the Sharia, no mention of religion. So it's a de facto secular worldview, which I'm suggesting begins to emerge in a very popular and very important genre of Persian literature known as the Mirrors for Princes. This little sentence here from Ibn Balkhi, this adage, is a perfect example of the kind of thing that was elaborated in that secular vision of kingship. But what's most interesting to me is that this was not confined to the Persianate world initially, or even the Islamic world, but even beyond the borders of the sultanates that existed in the 12th and 13th centuries. These ideas were attractive. If we move to India, if we move to the southern dynasty, the Kakatiyas, that ruled from the early 12th to the mid 14th century, we find a very important courtier at their capital of Warangal in eastern Deccan, eastern India, making this interesting proposition in one of his Telugu. This is not in Persian, this is in Telugu, the language of eastern India. To acquire wealth, make the people prosper. To make the people prosper, justice is the means. O Kirti and Rayana, they say that justice is the treasury of kings. Okay, so if we compare these two almost contemporary writers, one of them in the heart of the Islamic world, Ibn Balkhi, and one of them beyond the Islamic, or for that matter, the Persian world in South India, we see a remarkable parallel. And it illustrates, it seems to me, the way in which, the degree to which the core ideas of rulership, of kingship, was able to expand so dramatically, as we see here in this adage. So the notion of justice, so central. Here we see a coin of one of the most important sultans of Delhi, Iltutmish, with simply one word, adl, which means justice. or we fast forward to the Mughal Empire. Shah Jahan in one of his palaces in Shah Jahanabad in Old Delhi, you see right here the scales of justice that are visually making the same kind of statement. The same can be, even the word sultan is interesting here, because although it's an Arabic word, in the hands of Persian literati already by the 12th, 13th, and 14th century, that idea had already assimilated or appropriated the pre-Islamic Sasanian idea of the Shahanshah, the king of kings. So all the ideology, the worldview, the etiquette, the trappings of royalty, of which we now associate with sultans, actually goes back to the pre-Islamic rulers of Iran, most importantly the Sasanians. And what's also interesting is this is not necessarily an Islamic idea, not at all. Again, moving to South India, well beyond the range of any Muslim conquerors by this time. In the mid-14th century, the co-founder of the Hindu empire of Vijayanagara, which conquered the entire South India Sea here, styles himself Hindu Raya Suratala, which is a Telugu formulation of Sultan of Indian kings. So the word Sultan, in brief, has become so prestigious that it's now been assimilated into the vernacular vocabulary, in this case, Telugu vocabulary, as the most powerful word that's available in the mid-14th century. And architecture is probably the easiest way to see this process of emulation taking place. Staying for the moment with Vijayanagara in South India, this great city, which, by the way, in the 15th century, European writers described it as the largest city in the world, larger than any city they've seen in Europe, including Rome or Lisbon. Divided into two quarters, a sacred center by the banks of the Tungabhadra River, you see here, and a royal center about a half mile to the south. Now, the sacred center was where we find all these great temples, such as the temple of Virupaksha, who was the state deity of the empire of Vijayanagara, classical South Indian architecture, no surprises there. But you move only up 1/2 mile south of all these temples of the sacred center, the oldest part of Vijayanagara, and you see this. These are the state buildings of the rulers of Vijayanagara, who are using the arches and vaults and domes and so forth, straight out of the Persianate world. So there's a striking contrast between the religious center, the sacred center of this great capital, and the ruling center. It also extends to things like this palace. Well, we see here a platform where the columns had been, but it was a 100-column hall. Nothing in Hindu architecture before this had anything like a 100-column hall built here in the 14th century. But of course, the origins of this can be traced all the way back to Persepolis, the great king of the capital of the Achaemenid dynasty, Cyrus and Darius and so forth, with its 100-hall column. But these kinds of arches and domes taken over from the Persianate world were much later. And I would argue these really had to do ultimately with the diffusion of Timurid ideas, which expanded all over the place in the 15th century. Here we see an image of Timur himself, the great warlord based in Samarkand. This particular image, as we see here, is based on the reconstruction by the Soviets from his skull. This is what we think he looked like. But what's fascinating is how Timur, or Tamerlane as he was known in Europe, was kind of built up in the Western imagination as this over-the-top tyrant. I personally believe that the idea of Oriental despotism goes back to Christopher Marlowe, contemporary of Shakespeare, who writes this very popular play, Tamerlane, which depicts Tamerlane as this this, as I say, over-the-top tyrant, a ruler who is pulled around not by horses, but by defeated kings in his chariot. The capital of Vijayanagara, this Hindu dynasty, exhibits these extraordinary examples of Persian architecture. And my point simply is that these Hindu rulers wanted to participate or be seen as participating in a much wider world, and they wanted to be seen as part of that. This was the way they showed themselves to international ambassadors, and they wanted to say, look, we are part of this larger Persianate world. And I'm arguing here that this could be traced back to ultimately to the diffusion of ideas that came out of Central Asia, especially after the conquest of Tamerlane. So here's Timur, and here's Christopher Marlowe's. This is a photograph from a recent production in New York of the same play, which made such a big hit in London in 1587, and I believe is one of the origins of the whole idea of the Oriental despot, which became a big trope in European thought in the 19th and 20th centuries. And of course, here's a map we see of his conquests, and which took him, as you see, all over the place, including India in the southeast. And in a sense, he was trying to create a neo-Mongol empire, because he was himself partially descended from Genghis Khan. And but to recognize the importance of his architecture and how that diffused in the Persian world, we need to go back a little bit before Timur and look at the origins of Central Asian architecture. And this is simply an ordinary caravanserai that precedes the rise of the Timurids in Central Asia. And it's characterized by a great central entranceway where merchants would come with their caravans, with their horses, their donkeys, their goods, and keep them for security behind these walls. This is the model from which so many great mosques of Central Asia would kind of be descended from. We go from there straight to Timur. And now we're standing in Registan, and some of you will see this in a couple of months. Patronized, some of these are patronized by Timur himself. And the contrast in architecture and what he's trying to do here is simply stunning. We see here these monumental structures with brilliant glazed tile, the sun and the lion, ancient Iranian symbols seen here. And of course, his own tomb in Samarkand, Timur's own tomb. And the point I want to make here is that the features of this new style of architecture, I mean, everywhere he conquered, he brought back architects to Samarkand. He brought with him the best and the brightest from India, from Anatolia, from Iran, from Central Asia, everywhere. And they were commissioned to build the most spectacular monuments ever seen by people. And they really are, in a sense. They're distinguished by these very high drums, by new vaulting techniques that enable these arches and domes to soar upwards, by lavish use of glazed tile, you see everywhere on here, freestanding monuments with an overall aim of making bold visual statements that you could see from far away. And this broke with many traditions before Timur. And the point is that even though Timur dies in 1405, his legacy continues, and all these areas that he had conquered, or even not conquered, want to be the next Timur. They want to be the next Samarkand. And so, again, here we are. This is his own tomb in Samarkand with these brilliant glazed tiles and other Timurid era monuments like this. This is the Shahrisabz. Some of you will be visiting this place as well. It's a spectacular monument, the Aksaray Palace, which collapsed. There used to be an arch between these two great structures. But just to give you a sense of the extent, put people in this, you can see with the people below how large this place is. with this kind of geometric style of tiles, which became a hallmark of Timurid architecture. And this then would diffuse wherever the descendants of Timur would go. So we see, for example, in India on the right, this would be a madrasa that was built by Mahmud Gawan, who was a merchant who made it big in South India. In 15th century, after Timur, he patronizes this madrasa, which is very similar to the kinds of structures that the Timurids had already been doing. For example, this minaret in Herat. You compare the minarets, that you can see the similarities very clearly here. And here we see in Herat again the tomb and garden of Gohar Shad, who was the daughter-in-law of Timur, where you see the prominence of gardens. And we see this in miniatures, Timurid princes always outside in gardens, and this classic idea of Persianate garden, which precedes Timur, obviously, but is extended by Timur, with very formal fountains and channels and trees and walkways and so forth, and many miniatures. Here we see Babur, one of the descendants of Timur, who's from Samarkand, or at least the area of Samarkand, fails to conquer Samarkand and hold it. So he goes to India and starts the Mughal Empire. But on his way, he goes through Kabul, and we see him here planting out gardens, planting pomegranate trees in very formal gardens. So you have this very formal idea of Persian gardens patronized by Timurids and then taken all over the place. This is Babur's own garden complex in Kabul. But you have the same kind of symmetry laid out in places like Isfahan or in Kashmir, Srinagar, or in Agra. We can go on and on. You get the idea. Even the famous city on the eastern coast of America has inherited this very Persianate notion of the garden. So, and it's not just architecture and sultan and justice, but also attire, clothing. Here's a miniature painting from 16th century Bijapur, showing the kind of headgear that was worn by people. The word kolah is simply the Persian word for hat, but in the 16th century, it also connoted royalty, could mean a crown. And tunics were also used by Muslim rulers, but not only Muslims, but also Hindus, again. These are nobles of the Vijayanagara Empire, this very Persianized empire. And you see them here wearing the kolai, a Telugu word that's been assimilated from the Persian kula, and the kabai, which is another word assimilated from the kaba, or tunic. So again, we see how the emulation of not just architecture, not just gardens, but attire, food, cuisine, vocabulary, so many things of the Persianate world are moving well beyond the political borders of the great sultanates. Here in the courtyard of a city conquered by the ruler of Vijayanagara, Krishna Raya, is depicting himself wearing the same kind of tall hat in public here. So how does these ideas come to Vijayanagara? Very simple. Here we're seeing one of the platforms in the royal center of Vijayanagara, and among the figurines that are depicted along the surface, we see a Turkish horse merchant, because horses were imported by Turkish merchants from Central Asia to South India. And you could tell by the tunic, the pointed cap, the beard, all the rest of it, this is a foreigner bringing horses to South India. So Vijayanagara was connected in many ways with the Persianate world, not least the importation of war horses. And then finally, I'll close with this point. Another way in which the Persianate world diffused was through languages, new literatures that would emerge in regional languages that used Persian as their model. So this notion of a cosmopolitan vernacular can be extended to Turkish literature, Hindi literature, Deccani literature, even Malay literature in Southeast Asia, where we find, for example, in the Deccani language is one of several languages which did exactly this. The idea that when this language, which was carried from North India, originally it was Punjabi immigrants to the South in the 14th century, they become indigenized, they inaugurate their own language. Deccani is from obviously the region of the Deccan, but it incorporates ideals of meter and rhyme straight from Persian. And it uses Persian ideas of poetry to inform their own literary landscape. And in the same way, one can say the same thing happened with Urdu, to Turkish, even to Malay, where we have words associated with shipping that are straight out of Persian, or with commerce that comes straight out of Persian, or with political authority. All these words come straight into the Malay language, all of which is one more indicator. I mean, vocabulary, lexicon is another marker of how this Persianate world was diffused. And just to take one example of one work, one Persian work, the Saif al-Muluk. The Saif al-Muluk was a poem that was originally composed in Persian in Gujarat in the 13th century. And it next emerges in Chagtai Turkish in the court in Bukhara, in the Uzbek court in the 1530s. This same poem, which is a romance poem, I should say, the quest of a prince named Saif al-Muluk for his beloved. And he travels all over the world and he eventually finds her. But this poem moves through different languages, but it follows the same story and the same model of romance literature as the Persian original. So it goes into Chagtai Turkish, then it moves from there with the Mughal conquest of northern Iran in the early 16th century. It appears in Chagtai in North India. We next see it appearing in the Deccan, in Deccani, patronized by the sultans of Golconda, one of the kingdoms of South India. And from Golconda, the Saif al-Muluk story jumps over the Bay of Bengal to the Arakan coast, where it appears in Bengali. But Bengali literature is now again patterning itself after Persian literature. And the Saif al-Muluk is thus assimilated into Bengali in the same way that it had already been assimilated into Turkish and into Deccani, South India. Indeed, the Safavid court in Iran sends a mission out to Siam in Southeast Asia. And one of the ambassadors on that mission is sailing around the island of Sumatra, and he identifies this as the very region where Saif al-Muluk had discovered his beloved. My point here being that the Saif al-Muluk has now entered the imagination, not just in Persian, but also through Turkish, Chagtai Turkish, Deccani Urdu, Bengali, but all of it informed by one model. And it's in this sense that Persian literature and Persian ideas have diffused into other neighboring languages which look up to Persian for their models. So I'm going to simply end very briefly on this rather depressing note of the collapse of the Persianate world. And it doesn't take long to go through this. It has a lot to do with colonial intrusions in the 19th century, when Europeans took charge, whether it's French or Russians or English, of the old Persianate world. And what had been a unified world, in a sense, is now shattered by 19th century colonial rulers. And to get rid of these colonial rulers, to send the English back to England and the French back to France and so forth, requires nationalism. And we all know the story here. this idea of one language, one people, one land, and one state, which is a very European idea that gets now assimilated by the colonies. And so what happens now, of course, is that Persian is embraced by Iranian nationalists in the 19th century as their language. And we see this happening architecturally. The tomb of Ferdowsi, there's a great irony here. The Ferdowsi, as we've already seen, was the great author of the epic Shahnameh, which was responsible for diffusing Persianate language all over the place. Now the tomb of Ferdowsi is built by this Iranian nationalist, the Reza Shah Pahlavi, in the 1920s, directly patterned after the tomb of Cyrus the Great. It's not subtle, it's very clear. And what's happening here, of course, is a conflation between the 6th century Persian Empire of Cyrus with the 11th century Khorasan, which was Ferdowsi himself, and now 20th century Iran, all brought together in one absurdly anachronistic homology. And that is what nationalism does, of course. And I'll simply close with this thought that the Persianate world then can be seen as this vast territory where you have poets and literati scattered across from Istanbul through Bengal and even beyond. But the intrusion of Iranian nationalism, and I'll just put the flag up there and make it very clear, of the pre-Islamic flag, has meant that all these other poets have, in a sense, had to be assimilated into this Iranian national project. And at the same time, of course, these other countries that had been formerly a part of this Persianate world go off in their own way. The Republic of Turkey replaces the Arabic script with a Roman script and uses, of course, the language of Anatolia, gradually displacing the Persian part of that. In Central Asia, the Soviets also replace Arabic with Cyrillic, all of which detaches them from the original script of the Persian language. And in South Asia, of course, Hindi becomes a national language, or at least an official language, in the same way that Persian now has become the national language of Iran. So in this way, we've seen a collapse of something that had been around for 1,000 years, and which was born and incubated in Central Asia. So I just want to conclude with that final thought that the irony here, that the Persian language, and this map shows it all, the Bukhara with the Samanid dynasty in the 9th and 10th centuries was really where it all began, and then had this remarkable story of diffusion, and then this rather rapid collapse, in a sense, in the 19th and 20th centuries with the rise of nationalism.